Good morning and welcome to Crossroads. We are so glad that you are joining us this morning. At this time, I would love to invite you to stand up if you are able to and spend some time singing with us. Days when your heart feels like it's caving in, so that the peace begins. Sure as the dawn calls the sun, Jesus, we hear your love call out the light in us. Life like you meant it, can't contain it, hope in the heat and now, running wide, horizon in the rush of heaven. Life like you made it, I wanna live it, wider than all my dreams. Such a great adventure, welcome to the future. Will be days when you find you can't believe your eyes. Faith brings the world to life. Breathe in the air, it's a gift. Come on, just let it in. Your best days are still ahead. Horizon in a rush of heaven. Life like you made it, I wanna live it, wider than all my dreams. Such a great adventure, welcome to the future. I know who holds, I know who holds, I know who holds tomorrow. I know who holds. I know who holds, I know who holds tomorrow. Life like you meant it, I can't contain it. Hope in the here and now. What a wide horizon in the rush of heaven. Life like you made it, I wanna live it, wider than all my dreams. Such a great adventure, welcome to the future. I know who holds, I know who holds, I know who holds tomorrow.
Good morning, everybody. Just please remain standing. We just want to offer a quick welcome to everyone, whether you're here in the room or joining us online or out in the atrium. We're so happy that you have chosen to spend a little time with us on your Sunday morning today. We want to extend a special welcome to anyone who is joining us here for the first time. We want you to know that one of our core values here at Crossroads is inclusion. So no matter your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, your sexuality, you are welcome here. We believe that God loves everyone equally, and we try to live that out in everything that we do. So I'm Nicole. I am one of the Connect group leaders here at Crossroads. If you haven't, checked out the Connect groups, it's a great way to dive deeper into your relationships here, into your learning. And speaking of learning, Right now, out in our student center, we have got our student gathering going on for middle school and high school students. If you're a parent or a caregiver, our children's programming is going on right now as well. And today they are learning about wants versus needs and how that impacts inclusion. So here's what you can expect from this morning. In a minute, we're going to have a little more music, and then we're going to have some teaching. This week, we are continuing with the series called Explaining Jesus, Experiencing Christ. And we're exploring how understanding the historical Jesus actually shapes our faith, our actions, and our experiences with him today. We're also going to have a reflection in a minute in observance of Lent. And Lent is the 40 days or 6 weeks leading up to Easter. Some of us are taking a journey together by reading a book called The Art of Lent by Sister Wendy Beckett. And every Sunday, we are looking at a painting and listening to a reflection by Sister Wendy, and allowing that to help us dive a little deeper into the Lenten experience. So if you want to know more about the journey of Lent, please check that box on the back of your Connect card. We'll send you some information. So now we're going to enter into a time of prayer. So if you're here in the room with us, Mary and Shelley are going to be on either side of the stage ready to pray with you during this next song. If you're joining us remotely, the easiest way to request prayer is through the Crossroads app, or you can also text the word prayer to 970-570-0970. On our online campus, you can click the live prayer button. So now let's enter into some music and prayer.
Would rocks cry out to worship? Whose glory taught the stars to shine? Perhaps creation longs to have the words to say, but this joy is mine. With 1,000 times Jesus, this song is forever.
You can go ahead and have a seat. It is inadequate, even misleading, to speak of experience. It is inadequate, even misleading, to speak of experiencing joy, though it is impossible to find another phrase that can suggest what is meant. Joy is too great to be experienced. It is never our own, never within our power. It is rather that we are taken up into its vastness, and that what we experience is not joy itself, but its residue, our reactions, our emotions, after the vision has left us. Monet's White Clematis says something of this, if only in its impression of a vision too vast for his encompassing. The blazing whiteness, with the shimmer of purest lemon yellow at the heart, spills out and beyond the artist's canvas. We feel that no canvas, however large, can capture what is seen. In the most literal sense, this is a painting of a vision. We recognize it, not for what it is, but for what it makes us recall.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hands hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see.
Lenten season, please help us to remember the faithfulness that you have for us every single day. We thank you for your love, and just help us to remember. In your name, amen. Good morning, friends. My name is Wendy Howell, and I am a co-director of the Partners in Hope.
Yeah, my name's Scott Wilson. I have been coming to Crossroads along with my wife Jennifer for the last 25 years.
And as you've noticed, the Puerto Rico team is back. If you're in the room and you were on the Puerto Rico team, please just give me a wave if you're willing. Thank you. Thank you. We are very excited. While we were in Puerto Rico, we partnered with the Happy Givers, which is a partner of our Partners in Hope. And Scott is here to tell us a story about a community in the Happy Givers.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to be with my wife Jennifer, and there was 19 of us from our church, and went to Puerto Rico, partnered with an organization called Happy Givers that Wendy talked about. We had a team that sent several of us to Felix's house, and Felix is a resident of Puerto Rico. Felix is in his probably mid-60s and lives in an abandoned building, in an apartment in that abandoned building. And to say when we first got there, you can kind of see the picture of it. To say it was rough would kind of be an understatement. Felix in Spanish means happy. And it really just kind of tied in working with him and also Happy Givers. But his living conditions certainly weren't great. And we brought a team in and cleaned from really the first day that we got there, cleaned out his apartment. There was mold on the walls, bed bugs. It just wasn't great living conditions. And so we brought that in, got him a new mattress, a new refrigerator, microwave. He had not had running water for the last 6 years. So you can see a picture of him. He carried two 5-gallon buckets up to his apartment every day to use the restroom and to brush his teeth. So we were fortunate to be able to kind of do this, fix the mold and all of the stuff that was in his apartment. We got him running water. We got him a sewer line. So kind of really tied it together for me at the end. After working there for a week, and I wasn't able to communicate with Felix because he spoke Spanish. Obviously, I don't speak Spanish, but we communicated every day with a smile and a hug. He gave me a hug every day. And at the end, really, when we were leaving the last time, and we finally got him running water, he was so excited to be able to brush his teeth, and to be able to brush his teeth without having to bring a jug. So again, it was fun to partner with Happy Givers and Felix, and I know it was a huge blessing for us, and hopefully we made a difference for him too.
That's right. One of the core values of Happy Givers is dignity, and so we are happy to work with Happy Givers and help instill dignity in Felix's life. So if you're in the room, you have a program, so pick up that program and wave it at me. All right. On the front of that program, you will see a picture of Felix. And on Tuesday night, we have our Night of Storytelling Puerto Rico edition. And so all of our team is going to be there and telling more stories of our trip in pictures. So inside of that program is the communication card. So check that box that you'll attend the Night of Storytelling and hear all of our stories. I promise to keep it to an hour or 3. So make sure you're there, but really, we would love to share our stories with you. We have many to tell. So thank you, Scott, and thank you for supporting our trip. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to my great friend, Nicole, for some more announcements.
Okay, thank you. So just a couple more announcements for everyone. So you're definitely going to want a program for this morning. If you don't have a program, please raise your hand right now, and one of our room hosts will come around and bring you one. Inside your program, you will find your Connect card, which is for everyone every week. So if you're a regular attender, please check the box that says regular attender. If you're new here, go ahead and check that I'm new here box and fill out as much information as you feel comfortable doing. You're also going to find a giving envelope in your program. This is just one of the easy ways that we use to give to Crossroads. And at the end of the service, we'll have some people coming around to collect those from you, so just hold on to those through the service. Of course, you can also find all of these resources through the app. So there are digital versions of the program, the Connect card, lots of easy ways to give on the app. And then new to the app this week is the feed. The feed is going to give you all of the announcements and links that you need for the week. That will be found in the Connect section of the app. So in order to download the app, just go to Google Play or the App Store, or you can text to 833-270-1344. Finally, we're just asking you to keep Easter on your radar. This year at Crossroads, Easter is where love includes everyone. So Easter is on April 9th. We're going to have 2 services that day at 9 o'clock and 10:30. So please be thinking about, whoever you would like to invite to come with you that day. We're going to have a fun Easter party for the kids and, of course, an Easter egg hunt. So keep your eyes peeled for the feed so you can get more information about that and find out how you can serve if you'd like to do that on Good Friday or on Easter. So that's all I've got for you now. Go ahead and grab your talk notes or pull up the app, and Pastor Ryan will be up here in just a moment. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Such an intense trailer for this sermon series. I feel so much pressure when that music starts. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're going to be so disappointed yet again. It's good to see you today. Hey, if you're a guest this morning, thanks for being here. Thanks for staying through, and I totally get it if you want to slip out at some point during this portion, so no problems. Won't hurt my feelings, but it's great to have everybody here. Listen, I want to welcome those of you that are tuning in online. Maybe you're home, maybe you're traveling, maybe it's just warm and cozy and, whatever it might be, but thank you for being with us. If you're out in the atrium enjoying the sunlight, thank you for being out there today as we're in our series that is just a powerful, wonderful time to get together and just really think through what does it mean to understand and think about the historical Jesus, right? And so in week 1 of this series, what did we talk about? We said, the historical Jesus can help us understand our experience with the living Christ, that there is a Jesus of history, there's a Jesus of faith, and they relate to one another. And last week, Aisha kind of talked about this first week of really who was this historical Jesus, and she said Jesus was a person of the Spirit. And as such, invites us to have a spiritual experience, right? And that we don't take too much convincing if you're here at church, right? So I'm going to ask those of you that are up in the booth to switch over to my presentation. That'd be wonderful. How many of you are doing NCAA March Madness brackets? Anybody? Anybody 100% correct so far? No, not at all. Nobody is? You sure about that? What was the biggest upset for you? I'm filling time right now for the tech booth, so help me out. What was the biggest upset in your bracket? Princeton. Yeah, I hate Princeton. Can we talk about Princeton for a little bit? All right, this will give them plenty of time. Let me just share with you my problem with Princeton, okay? So in 1998, Princeton stole $50 from me. Stole it. They did. You think I'm lying to you. $50, 1998, I'm a senior in my undergraduate work, and I'm applying to graduate programs in Princeton, second-class school I was applying to, right? And I also applied to another little school. But I got a letter from Princeton, and it said, unfortunately, we didn't review your application, but thank you for applying. I said, was it that bad? Was it really that bad that you didn't even look at it? So being kind of a logical person, I called and said, well, if you didn't look at my application, would you please send me my $50 back in an application fee? I said, I'm not quite understanding what happened here. And they said, no, we don't do that. I said, don't you have an endowment or something? I mean, you're a pretty old college. Like, help me understand what's going on there. They said, we have a rolling admission. So we, as applicants come in, we, award letters, and we had just filled all our spots before your application. I said, well, was my application late? I feel like I hit the deadline. They were, no, you turned it in on time. So this is what I said to the Princeton admissions department. And they were certainly interested in my thoughts on their process, I imagine. So I said, so what you're telling me is you aren't interested in getting the best candidates. You're interested in getting the best candidates early. Like, yeah, that was it. So from there on, I vowed to destroy Princeton. So hasn't really happened, but there you go. I know, they are 16th seed in my mind, that's for sure, undoubtedly. So, all right, listen, so hey, how many of y'all have ever had a situation in your life where you've had to think, you're looking and you go, this is not going to end well? Some of you are thinking that right now. You've heard the first few minutes, you're like, this is not going to end well. I'm never going to get home for the game, right? You've thought that you've just watched and you've seen like, this isn't going to end well. Maybe you're watching a TikTok video, it's a nice simple, you're like, oh, this is not, but I'm not going to not watch this ending, right? Maybe somebody you're out driving and somebody's driving super aggressively and they just fly by you and you're like, that's not going to end well. You just kind of know it's going to happen. Maybe you got a friend who you look at and you just go, I think they're making some unhealthy choices, given your own experiences, and you say there's a high likelihood that this is not going to end well. Maybe there's somebody new at work and they don't know all the political dynamics at work and they kind of jump in and they start heading down a path, a direction, and you're like, oh no, that is not going to go well, right? Maybe you've experienced a culture around you kind of walking towards a cliff. And you think to yourself on like January 6th, this is not going to end well, right? There's that reality, like we live those experiences. And in those moments, what are we? We're faced with a choice, right? We have this choice. Do I jump in? Do I say something? Do I get involved? Or do I just sit back and watch it happen, right? What am I going to do? And some of us, like, you've gotten involved, right? Sometimes you get involved. You say something. And you go, I just don't know. What do you see in her? What do you see in him? Like, is marriage really the right thing, right? You get involved. You have that conversation. And maybe your relationship is stronger for it, right? Maybe they say, oh, I just hadn't thought of that. Maybe you get involved with an organization to get active around something that you see in your community that's problematic. And at the end of the day, your community is stronger because you got engaged. You feel better about yourself. But sometimes the decision to get involved does the exact opposite, right? Sometimes we just feel compelled. Sometimes we just butt in when we shouldn't, right? Sometimes that happens, and then what? Like the relationship is damaged. The community is damaged. There's kind of a death of sorts. And so that decision to get involved can bring joy, but it can also bring pain. How many of y'all ever experienced that? Raise your hand nice and high, right? I've experienced both of those. I've learned like, okay, if I don't get asked the question, don't give the answer. Right? And sometimes you do it anyway. But the truth is, there was this big choice. There was a lot going on in the time of the historical Jesus. And the historical Jesus was faced with kind of a similar circumstance. He saw the reality of what was happening in the Jewish homeland at the time. And I think the historical Jesus, as he came of age, as he grew up as a young man living in Nazareth, just off the Sea of Galilee, I think he thought to himself, something's got to give. There's so much happening here. And the truth is, what we know from history is that the world of Jesus in that first century, that we'll call it, what one historian calls it, the matrix of his life, the entanglement that's all around him. It's not just background that you can separate, but it's just the entire matrix with which Jesus would have grown up in, right? That social world was in crisis, and it was brewing. And I know we know nothing about a brewing social crisis. We have no concept of this. So you're really going to have to dig in today and try and understand the tension that might have been experiencing. But that world of Jesus was in crisis, and there were some dominoes that had fallen, all right? So you're going to have to hang in there with me, because eventually we're going to get to Jesus in the Bible. But if we don't understand the history, we will misunderstand Jesus, okay? So can you stick with me? Oh, thank you, 6 of you. This is going to be fantastic. All right, listen. Now here's the scoop. What had happened, there were 3 big dominoes that had fallen, like they had hit one another in perfect timing and perfect succession, that had created this cultural crisis. The first was Rome had annexed the Jewish homeland. So Rome, about 60 years before the birth of Jesus, had taken basic control, tax control of this area. And they had put in some client kings or puppet kings, right? They were usually of Jewish descent of some sort, and they were considered like king of the Jews. Now, Herod the Great is a name some of you heard. You ever heard of Herod the Great? Right? So Herod the Great, he was kind of the Rome puppet client king from about 37 to 4 BCE, right? Or BC, whichever you prefer. And he kind of he built up the area, but he was kind of brutal. Nobody liked him at all. Nobody liked Herod the Great. And so when Herod the Great was when he died, now all the tension starts to really brew up. And what happens is in that moment, the Jewish homeland feels the full weight of the Roman army, because Rome comes in with a garrison and squelches an uprising that took place around the year 4. It was led by a guy named Judas from Galilee. Right? This is important. Like, this is the area Jesus would have grown up in. He would have been born about a decade after this happens. And in that moment, the Roman garrison comes down. They come into this area, and they squelch a revolution that was taking place. And they had a mass crucifixion. They crucified 2,000 Jewish rebels. 2,000 in one day. They said, this is what Rome does. Right? So the raid happens, and then Rome kind of sets up a little bit more power. And they say, this is going to be a problem. So Rome takes Herod's territory and divides it into 4 areas, right? And he divides that up between Herod's 3 sons and his sister. All right? And now there's 2 of these areas that are really important and particularly of interest when we talk about Jesus. The first is the area that included Jerusalem. Right? So this area was known as Samaria, Judea, and Idumea, these 3 kind of areas, and they were given to Herod Archelaus, one of Herod's sons. Now, this dude was so bad at his job. So bad. How many of y'all ever had a bad boss? You ever experienced a bad national leader, in your opinion? Maybe. I don't know, right? So here's the scoop. This guy is so bad. Say, how bad? It's a joke. This guy is so bad. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Y'all are good. Okay. He is so bad that the Jewish people, they send a delegate to Rome, and they're like, you would be better than this guy. They go to Rome, and they're like, can you please get rid of Herod Archelaus and put somebody else in power? So that's what happens. They appeal to the emperor. The emperor removes Herod Archelaus from control of Jerusalem and turns it into a Roman province. And now Rome is going to send governors into Jerusalem, Judea, and Idumea, and they are going to govern that area firsthand. And they were going to send some winners to govern, right? Because why does Rome's like, I just got to keep this little area because we got to keep the people from the west and the east, and it like gets us into Asia, and they don't really care too much about the area except it's a big roadway, right? So they're not sending the best and the brightest from Rome, okay? They're sending second-rate governors down there. And so one of those governors, you probably heard the name, is Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate comes in the 20s. So now that area is controlled by Rome. The other area that's of interest is kind of in the north, and that's the area called Galilee and Perea. And this area became under the rule of Herod Antipas, another one of Herod's sons. Now, he seemed to flourish in that area because he remained in power until 39. So he remained in power for almost 45 years. Herod did all kinds of like building projects, kind of followed in his dad's footsteps. One of the big things he wanted to do was commercialize the Sea of Galilee. We'll talk about that in a second. I know you're super excited, okay? And here's one of the crazy things that Herod Antipas did. Herod Antipas moved the capital of that area from a town called Sepphoris, which was just outside of Nazareth, which you've heard of Nazareth before, but he moved it and he built a city on the sea called Tiberias after the emperor Tiberius. He knew what he was doing, right? He's like, this is after you. Like, this probably stayed in power, right? He understood the politics of the day, right? And so all this is happening inside of it. Now, Rome comes in. Rome is in control. What does Rome do immediately? Tax you, right? Rome comes in and says, you are now going to pay tribute to Rome. And what this does, particularly for the Jewish people, not necessarily for every people that Rome conquers, but for the Jewish people, it created a system of double taxation. If you're a fill-in-the-blank kind of person today, that's one of your fill-ins, double taxation. And everybody was like, that sounds like fun, right? No. So what? And why is it a double taxation? Because the Jews already had a tax system. It was called the tithe, right? So Jews gave about 20% of all of the crops that come in. They would bring 20% basically into the temple. And this would pay for the priests, the upkeep of the temple staff. They were known as the Levites, and it would care for the poor. So that's what they did. Well, the Roman tax system, if you owned land, was 1% of your land's value and 12.5% of your crop. So what does that mean? That means that the Jewish people were being taxed about 35%. And most of the Jewish people were living at a subsistence level, right? You had a huge gap. I know we don't know anything about income gaps, wealth gaps, things like that, but they did. So this creates a big problem. Now, you got 35% tax burden, and on top of that, how Rome collected taxes was they had what were called tax farmers. Fun job, right? So they were hired to go collect the taxes, and then those tax farmers were responsible to pay a set fee. And how did the tax farmers make their money? They imposed more taxes. They imposed a fee onto the people they were taxing. So you got a 35% tax burden, and you've got the tax collectors or the tax farmers that are coming. And then if you live in Galilee and you work on the sea, you're a fisherman, probably what's happening is Antipas is paying for all of his building projects. He's moving the capital. That's an easy task, doing all that. And how is he paying for it? The commercialization of the Sea of Galilee is probably what he's doing. So if you have a fishing business, what happens? Well, you can no longer just go out on the sea, do your business, fish, come back. You've got to do what? You've got to pay to put your boat on the sea. And then what you catch in the sea, you've got to bring a portion and pay for that, right? Like Antipas was no dummy. He was like, this is how I'm going to generate revenue. Now, it's no wonder why Jesus, his disciples were what? Most of them were fishermen because they were fed up. Like they were receiving the worst of it in a lot of ways. Now, what was fascinating was the Jewish culture, the Jewish leadership had no legal sanction if a person didn't pay their tithe. They couldn't legally do anything. And neither would Rome. Rome didn't enforce that. Rome didn't care if you paid your tithe to the Jewish temple or whatever. That's your issue. You're just going to pay us. So what happens is this double taxation creates a system where if you were in, say, a normal life, you couldn't do all of that. You just couldn't afford to live. You couldn't eat. You couldn't feed your family. So you had to make a choice. Do I pay my taxes to Rome or do I pay my taxes to the temple? Now, Rome can come and take me. What can the Jewish leaders do? Well, they just kind of ostracize you. And in a shame culture, honor-shame culture, that's a big deal. But this creates a crisis in the faith because you have a whole group of people who become non-observant Jews. That means that they were forced to choose to pay one of those taxes. They chose to pay the Romans, and now they're no longer allowed to go into the temple. They're no longer allowed to participate in religious life. There's a whole bunch of shame that gets put onto them. So that what emerges, another domino now, is a religious crisis. We don't have people coming to the temple. We don't have people paying the temple tithes. How are we going to support everything? And so what happens during this time is the third domino. And that third domino is that there had always been kind of a politic of holiness, what one historian calls. And this politics of holiness, right, this became a dominant way of thinking about Judaism. And it became the dominant theme within the Jewish cultural world, and it was a response to all of Rome's occupation. It was a response to the taxes not being paid in the temple. And it was kind of a doubling down on the holiness codes in the Torah. Do this, don't do this, be a part of this. And it was all about, the word holiness just means to be separate. And so holiness code and holiness politics was grounded in this idea that we are to be separate, right? We're to be different. So it was very dualistic. There were good people and there were bad people. There were righteous and there were unrighteous. There was clean and there was unclean. There was Jew and there was Gentile. Part of the dominant thinking in that day was if you were holy, if you were righteous, if you were clean, you would get a reward from God. If you were unrighteous, if you were unclean, if you were unholy, you would be punished by God. Right? And so this became like the dominant way of interpreting the scripture, the dominant way of thinking, the dominant way of managing people giving their tithe into the temple. And it started way back. It started way back in the exile when Israel was exiled and they were living in foreign lands. And this was a way to kind of preserve your national identity. And most of the sages, the rabbis, the people who would like teach the Torah in that day, they would teach it through the framework of holiness because this was the wisdom of the day. It was the popular wisdom. But here's the thing, right? If we just like step back, the holiness politic at the end of the day was like an extremely racist reality. Can I just say that out loud? Like if I were to stand up here today and say, here's the deal. If you're in here and you're American, I don't want you talking to anybody who's not American. I don't want you having dinner with anybody who's not American. You would say what? That's racist. If I say we're going to build a church and we're going to put a wall around this church and we're not going to let people come into this church that aren't American or that aren't white or that aren't this or that aren't that, you would say that's racist. I mean, it's not a trick question, right? If I were to say you are only allowed to marry people of your nationality, no international marriages, no interracial marriage, you would say that's, hang in there with me, all right? But that's what the politics of holiness was. And there was this active movement at the time of Jesus to double down because it was trying to salvage Judaism, and it was trying to keep their identity. And it was saying, this is who we are. And so there were 3 active renewal movements in the day. And it intensified this politic of holiness. Like it just took it to the nth degree. So these 3 groups you might have heard of. One was called the Essenes. And the way that the Essenes thought was, hey, we are radical separatists. We live outside of Jerusalem. If you've ever heard of the Qumran community where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, you probably haven't. That's okay. But they would practice their own sacrifices. They would stay away from the temple because they said the leadership is unclean and pure. They're not doing it right. So they were like radical separatists. If you've ever heard of Masada and you ever heard of that final like suicide, those were probably Essenes. A lot of people think John the Baptist was influenced by Essenes. Now, the second group many of us have heard of is the Pharisees. And when I say Pharisees, if you grew up in church, immediately what comes to your mind is like, dun, 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 like villainous people, okay? Can we just that's just PR from the gospel writers, okay? That's the PR campaign of the gospel writers. Pharisees were not bad people. Pharisees had a deep faith. Pharisees were concerned about their people. Rabbinic Judaism that we have today traces its heritage back to the Pharisees, right? Like in the first century, you have Pharisees being martyred by Rome because they would not, they wouldn't sway from what they believed. But they were very zealous for it. Their way of thinking was, we need a kingdom of priests. And what they meant by that was everybody needs to undertake the holiness requirements of the priests. If everybody lives like the priests, God will protect our homeland. If everybody lives like the priests and we follow all the rules, then everything is going to be wonderful. So they were devoted deeply to absolute loyalty to God. And we think of them because we've grown up like, oh, these were the enemies of Jesus. They were a different political party than Jesus, right? They thought differently. The gospel writers they bring up this hyperbole about the Pharisees. And I'm sure there were some that Jesus was in conflict with, but these are not bad people, okay? They loved the same things that even Jesus would love. They loved the Sabbath. They understood the richness of the festivals. They believed in prayer and fasting. They thought this was the way. And social pressure was their tool, right? So they would only give their tithe to the priests that actually followed the priestly rule, right? And they were quick to say, if you didn't follow their way, you're out. But they had this beautiful understanding. Paul was a Pharisee and never stopped being one, by the way. Like, it's my belief that Paul never stopped being a Pharisee. And if you read Paul and you don't read it through that lens, you're going to miss something really beautiful. Paul's always in tension with Jesus and the Pharisaic background that he has. Now, they accepted Roman rule, the Pharisees did. They just said, only resist Rome when they ask you to do something that's against the holiness code, right? Now, there was this other philosophy, and a historian of antiquity, a guy named Josephus, who wrote a couple of big histories, he calls it a fourth philosophy. And this was really a philosophy of violence against Rome. Like, they were active, violent resistors. They would do anything to get rid of Rome. Rome was the problem, right? So you have these 3 movements all taking place at the time that Jesus is born. And it's bubbling up, and this politics of holiness is really building this tension, okay? And what happens is this. These cultural dynamics, they create a new social group. And this new social group, in all this literature, they become sinners and outcasts. So if you had to choose to pay Rome instead of the temple, right? If you wouldn't fit in line with the Pharisaical way of resistance, if you weren't an Essene, if you didn't fit into this fourth way of resistance, you were a sinner or an outcast. And it was a social group, virtually untouchable. If you've ever heard of like the untouchables, that class, this was a class system. They didn't fit the conventional wisdom of society, and so they were seen as outcasts, cursed by God. And so here's the thing, all of this, so the Roman injustices, the economic pressure, the loyalty that Judaism had to this like politic of holiness, It was leading the country to war. And I believe deeply that Jesus knew it. I believe deeply that Jesus, as a young man, looked and saw what was happening like so many and said, this is a path that will lead us to destruction. And in fact, it did. The Great War with Rome happened in 66 to 70. They took control of the city. They destroyed the temple. They burned it. Now, in the midst of all of this, right, in the midst of the Pharisees and the Essenes, this fourth way of thinking, the Sadducees, they were kind of a group of aristocrats. They really weren't into renewal, totally different. Like, where did Jesus fit in? What was Jesus in all of this? The historical Jesus, the guy who grew up in Nazareth, who grew up next door to a place where 2,000 people were crucified. Some historians have thought, I think imaginatively and creatively, that Joseph might have been killed in that revolt. Right? Like, how do we think about this? What is that Jesus? And there's a couple things that emerge from that picture that historians have said, this is who Jesus was. First, Jesus was a sage. Like, Jesus was a sage who challenged conventional wisdom by teaching an alternative way. So a sage is a teacher of wisdom. Now, I know immediately right now, some of you that are listening, you're tuning in, you're like, oh, not my Jesus. My Jesus is way more than that. Okay, just hold on to that thought for a second. But Jesus is all the time in our Gospels, he's addressed as what? Teacher, rabbi. And he's addressed by the people who love him and the people who don't like him. Okay? So I get that for many of us, the exalted Jesus, the post-Easter Jesus, is way more than just a sage. But we have to say historically, he's nothing less than this. Right? He would have been seen as a sage. And as a sage, he had two big themes, he had probably three, but two themes that I want to talk about today real quickly in his teachings. Two great themes that he would talk about. One, Jesus taught an image of reality. So if you were to be so lucky as to have Jesus traveling by and you could go hear him, he would talk about life as ultimately spirit. And Aisha touched on this last week. He would teach an image of reality that said, there is a kingdom, right? He would use the word kingdom, and it's patriarchal, but we might say a realm or a reign of God that is beyond what we can see. It's deeper than that. And he would teach that this realm, that this spirit, is ultimately gracious and understanding. So totally different than the politic of holiness, totally different than the God that is being portrayed and the reality that's being portrayed by the conventional wisdom. Okay? Now, to display this reality, Jesus would do something very, very countercultural. He would eat with sinners. So he lived out this reality, this idea of a compassionate God. He demonstrated it. He incarnated it, if I can use a theological word, by eating with sinners. And when we hear that word sinners, we have to recognize what we're talking about. In the time, these are people that the dominant system has excluded and pushed out. They couldn't pay their taxes. They couldn't meet the requirements of conventional wisdom. So this class that was created, Jesus would go and eat with them. In Mark chapter 2, verse 16, Mark says that some scribes who were Pharisees, right? So what were they? They had an occupation in the community. They were scribes, but they had given over to and believed in this revitalization movement led by the Pharisees. So they were trying to live all the priestly requirements, okay? Because anybody could be a Pharisee. That was what they wanted. Pharisees wanted you to join and become a Pharisee, and then you would work your way up because you would follow all the rules and be that priest, that kingdom of priests. So there were scribes who were Pharisees, and they saw that Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors, the tax farmers, right? Those people. And they said, why does he do that? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Doesn't he know? The conventional wisdom, every sage of the day, every system was saying, one, it was creating the problem, but was saying God is punishing them. Now, Jesus, to talk about this quality of God as compassionate, he would show it, or as kind of inclusive of like being there, right? Jesus would eat with sinners, but he would often use this word compassionate, or sometimes it's translated merciful, to describe God in this realm. This was kind of his favorite word. And it's actually the plural of the Hebrew and Aramaic word that means womb. Now imagine this. Jesus, one of his favorite words to describe the ultimate spirit, the ultimate reality, had this connotation of wombishness. that this living reality, this depth of being was nourishing, it was life-giving, it was tender. And as Jesus would talk about that, he would then begin to talk about an alternative way of being, right? So he was a sage, and he talked about this compassionate God, and he would eat with sinners. And then he would talk about there's this different way of living. There's two ways of living, and you can make your choice, but this alternative way was a way of transformation, because Jesus recognized and said, there's a problem. And he would oftentimes do what sages would do, is they would speak of two different paths, two different ways that you could travel on, and he would use different metaphors. One metaphor that he would use was narrow and broad road. How many of you have heard of the narrow and broad way? So Jesus would say, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and those who enter through it are many. How narrow the gate and constricted the road that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Now, given what we know about the historical Jesus, what is he talking about? Do we think Jesus is talking about the Pharisaical way of living with all the rules and following all the morality, and you got to fit in and be pure? Or is Jesus saying the exact opposite, that the narrow way that will lead to life is compassion and inclusion and grace? Because this path is leading to revolt against Rome. You're asking people to revolt against Rome. You want people to follow all the temple rules at the expense of Rome. It's going to lead to war. He would talk about a wise and foolish way. Same principle, right? He would talk about building your house. He said, if you listen to these words of mine and act on them, you're like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. You've heard this before, maybe. The rain would fall, the floods would come, and the winds blew and buffeted the house. But what would happen? It didn't collapse because it had been built solidly on a rock. But everyone who listens to my words and doesn't act on them will be like a fool who builds his house or her house on the sand. The rain will fall, the floods will come, the winds will blow, and the house will be buffeted, but it will collapse and it will be ruined. Now, what was Jesus saying? What was the foundation? Is the foundation purity culture and rules and morality? No. The foundation is compassion and tenderness. That's what you build on, and that was the narrow way in Jesus' historical context. Nobody's going around saying what Jesus is saying, by the way. I mean, there's a new movement taking place of nonviolent resistance that Jesus probably falls into, but nobody's walking around going, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. No. Everybody's going around saying, be more righteous and God won't punish you. Follow the rules and God will protect our land. And for Jesus, he would say the broad way is this path that leads to anxiety and selfishness and exclusion. Like that was the condition. And it would lead to a blindness to God all around us. He would talk about blind people following blind guides, missing God. And so the politics of holiness, the idea of separation and exclusion, of rewards and punishment from a God based on behavior, would lead to anxiety and selfish behavior. It's just about me. I've got to make sure I'm good. I've got to make sure I follow all the rules, and you got to be just like me. It was common then, and it's common now. It was the broad way then. It's the broad way now. And Jesus would say there's a different path. And he would kind of give some metaphors as to what it meant to walk this path. He would say to be on this path, you're going to have a new heart. You're going to have a new heart. You see, Mark chapter 7 talks about the heart. If you want to dive into it, read all of Mark chapter 7, and you'll see like over and over again, Jesus is just talking about there's a heart problem. There's a heart problem. In verse 6, he says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. This was in response to people coming and challenging the fact that his disciples didn't ritually wash their hands. They didn't follow the rules. And he says, but they do all the right things, but their heart is far from God. They're following all the rules. The outside looks great, but the inside is a mess. Verse 14 and 15, Jesus would summon the crowd together, and he said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand, nothing that enters one from outside can defile the person, but things that come out from within the heart are what defile us. See, it was a heart reality. Verses 20 through 23, he said, what comes out of a person, that's not the deal. Right? What comes out of a person, that's what defiles, not what goes in. Right? From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts and unchastity and theft and murder and adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within and they defile. It's not that you're not following a rule. It's not that you're not living up to it or that you're going out. You're not living outside the city with the Essenes, or you're following all the rules of the Pharisees, or you're raising up arms with the active resistors. No. There's a heart condition that has to get fixed. And he would talk about part of that condition getting fixed is learning to center on the Spirit, to live a life focused on that spirit world. What Aisha talked about, we all have different experiences with that spirit dynamic. But Jesus would say you have to choose to orient your life around a loyalty to the things of God. And for him, that was compassion and justice and inclusion and mercy and forgiveness. For the gospel writers, it was his great proclamation that day in the temple. I'm here to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom to the captives. Right? That's the focus on spirit. Jesus would oftentimes talk about there's two competing centers in your heart. There's a physical, material world that produces anxiety, that produces pain and exclusion, or there's the world of spirit. Luke 16:13 says, no servant can serve two masters. They'll either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Like, think of it, you can't serve the spirit reality and the physical reality, which is oftentimes reduced to money and wealth. Matthew 6:19-20, famous passage. Preachers love this one. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and decay, and where thieves break in and steal. No, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor decay destroys, nor thieves break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So we have orange kiosks in the back today. As you exit, you can just empty your wallet. Come on now. If we don't understand the historical Jesus, we'll abuse the Jesus of the Gospels. What Jesus is saying here is you center your life on the things of heaven, the Spirit, God, you're going to store up treasure. If you focus on building the bigger and bigger barns, what's going to happen? One day you're going to be gone and there's just going to be big barns filled with stuff that somebody's got to go through. Way to bless them. And Jesus would also say that this path, this way, was a way of a new heart, right? He would talk about it being a way of centering on God, but he would also say it was a way of death. And we march towards that understanding as we head towards Good Friday. But he would talk about this, and he would say that this way of choosing life, this way of a new heart would require a death of sorts of an old heart. Very famous passage, Luke 9:23. Jesus said, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny themselves, and they must take up their cross and follow me. This death is an internal process, daily dying to selfishness, daily dying to the desire to exclude, to scapegoat, to say the problem's out there. It's a death to the conventional wisdom of our day that says these people are right, those people are wrong. Here's how you can succeed. Here's what it means to excel. It's a death to a religion in Jesus' day that would legitimate a way of life rather than invite people to a new way of life. Right? When religion becomes a legitimization of what I believe about my country, what I believe about my God, there's a problem when healthy religion ought to be an invitation into a completely new way of life that rebinds us to the spirit world. But again, we don't have that problem today. Baptism for the earliest church, right, for the earliest followers of Jesus, is what baptism was, right? It was this ritualized way of saying, I'm dying with Christ to my old self, and I'm being resurrected into a new life. This life in the Spirit, this life with different priorities and different values. And so ultimately, what Jesus was doing, this guy who walked this earth, who a movement followed after him, he started a Jewish revitalization movement that was grounded in compassion. That's what the historical Jesus was about. It was deeply Jewish. He says it over and over. Jesus was concerned only with the Jews. The mission to the Gentile came later. It gets imposed back in, but Jesus, he sends out the 12, right? And he says what? Go out, heal the sick, eat with people, but only go to what? The lost sheep of Israel. Matthew 10, chapter 5, verse 6. He sends out the 12 on a mission. And he instructs them, don't go into pagan territory or enter a Samaritan town. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, who are the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Historically speaking, they're the ones that the system pushed out. It's not people who just said, well, I just hate the law. I hate Judaism. I hate that God. I'm going to go live however I want. I'm going to be licentious. I don't care. It's all a bunch of garbage. No, it's a system, a politic of holiness that said if you don't do all these things, you can't be a part. You're out. And if you're not in, then we're going to shame you and exclude you. And now that's proof that God is punishing you. See, that's the lost sheep of Israel. Go out. When Jesus says, leave the 99 to follow the one in John, John's given this beautiful, that's what it's about. Has nothing to do with moral guidelines, has nothing to do with people not living up to a standard, has everything to do with what the culture was doing to people in the day, excluding. If you couldn't follow the conventional wisdom, if you couldn't live under that politic, if you didn't have the economic means, then you were labeled an outsider, a sinner. And so compassion, it was the pathos, it was the essence of his work and his movement, but it was also the essence of his politics. Whoa. Of course, Jesus was political. He died a political death. So he emphasizes compassion over holiness. That's the ethos, right? In Luke chapter 6, verse 6, Jesus has the audacity to change the Bible. Did you know that? This guy, born a peasant with no money, no house, doesn't even have a father. This guy decides that he has the authority to change the law, change the Leviticus. Here's what he says in Luke 6, verse 6. He says, be merciful, or compassionate. It's that word for compassion, just as also your Father is merciful or compassionate. The original word there is holy. Right? The climax of the Leviticus holiness code says, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And Jesus comes along and says, oh, sorry, we're not going to emphasize that. We're going to emphasize the compassion. And he changes the whole game. Everybody listening to Jesus would know exactly what he was doing there, because that phrase, be holy, as I, Lord your God, had been thrown in their face. And here comes this guy who says, wait a second. Let's be compassionate and merciful as your heavenly Father is compassionate and merciful. And this turned into politics, the way of organizing society, breaking down walls, actual actionable things. He told his disciples, eat with anyone, include and associate with women. The nerve. Poverty is not a punishment of God. Blessed are the poor. What? No, blessed are the poor, for they'll inherit the kingdom of God. And that is this unseen spirit world. They'll be able to see it. Those are the ones that should be teaching us. Poverty is not a punishment from God. It's a product of human injustice. It's a product of all these systems. His movement would become the peace party right there in Palestine. He would say these crazy things like, love your enemy. Go the extra mile when Rome comes. He would talk about nonviolent resistance. Give to Caesar what's Caesar, to God's what's God's. Marcus Borg, a Jewish historian who's passed away, a Jesus historian, who's passed away, he wrote this beautiful book that we're using as a part of a framework for this. It's called A Vision, Jesus, A New Vision. And in it, he writes this. He says, Jesus sought to transform his social world by creating an alternative community structured around compassion, with norms that moved in the direction of inclusiveness, acceptance, love, and peace. So we're finally to the point. Explaining the historical Jesus, understanding the guy who walked around when people had no concept or no thought of like atonement, dying on a cross for sins. Before any of that would emerge, this historical Jesus walked around. And understanding that invites us now to experience this living Christ, this exalted one, as a compassionate guide on the narrow peacemaking path. That's what it means, right? Now I can experience this Jesus, this Spirit, this God, this realm as a compassionate guide to myself. Oh, man, I messed up. Hey, relax. Relax. That's not God. God's compassion. Relax. That's the way we think about God. That's God in our image. No. So you walk this peacemaking path that Jesus says it's narrow, it's hard, it's difficult. It leads to life, though, not just for you, but for others. So in your everyday normal life, how do we live this out? Knowing what we know about Jesus, the context, the history, the fire hose you just drank from, what does that mean for us today? Well, some simple things. Question the conventional wisdom of the day. Question it. Look for the modern holiness politics. It's there and it will always be there because it is the conventional wisdom of society that there's a group of people that belong and there's a group of people that don't belong. That is the conventional wisdom of the day. So look for who conventional wisdom says doesn't belong and run to them and you will experience and encounter Jesus. I promise you that. We should always be questioning that. Who in my life do I think shouldn't belong? Who is it? Who's the scapegoat? Who's the problem? Who are the rules not meant for? Who are the rules are fixed against? Faith rules, cultural rules, where are they? Second thing we can do is center our life on the compassionate, caring, loving nature of Spirit. I think it was who was it? Rene Girard. I think he said, we should take 100 years and not use the word God because we've so messed it up. We've just so messed it up. So much baggage with that word. So center our life on God, but if that word brings a lot of baggage, think about centering your life on the compassionate nature of reality to which Jesus points is the deepest truth. So how do we center? We make real life decisions, real-time decisions around our money, our time, our values, all those things. We live with enough. We make choices. We involve ourselves in compassionate and merciful work in our communities and in our world. It will not be popular. It won't be popular. It never has been popular. No matter what you call it, the Jesus movement of compassion, of going against conventional wisdom, will never be popular. It won't be. But it's the narrow path. It's that narrow path. And I would say, I get it, it's weird, but maybe if you've never done this, consider baptism. We still baptize people. I know it's weird. I get it. I totally get it. Baptism was like a part of normal life in the first century. And I really do believe if Jesus were here today, he'd be like, I cannot believe you all are doing that. Because I think Jesus has a sense of humor, right? I just do. I think he'd be like, oh my gosh, you all are nuts. All right, if we're going to do it, let's do it, you know? I think it's not a rule, but I think we still do it because it can be this beautiful moment where we say, I have new life in Christ. But I don't believe it's to appease a God that is mad at us. I believe it's to say, I want to be a part of the kingdom. I want to be a part of this way of living that is filled with compassion and inclusion that reflects the God that Jesus revealed. So we're going to do baptisms on April 16th if you want to be a part of that. And how does this make the world a better place? Well, I have this belief that compassion makes suffering unacceptable in a community. That when we really ground ourselves in compassion, suffering becomes unacceptable. But if we are grounded in this idea that, well, people just need to work harder, if we're grounded in this idea that people just need to make better choices, it's up to them. I'm not responsible for that choice that they made. We're okay with suffering because what do we say? Oh, they brought it on themselves. But when compassion that Jesus reveals as the mark of the truest reality begins to overwhelm us, when you see suffering, it becomes unacceptable and you just begin to relieve the suffering. And I think that's love. I think that's love. I think that's how we reverse our thinking about enemies and friends. So over the next few moments, the band's going to just play a song and we're going to let you store up some treasure in heaven. We're going to receive the offering and the Connect cards. Everybody's got something to give today. Your Connect card. Put that in there. Put a prayer request in there. If you're new and like the whole giving thing is weird for you, I totally get it. If you're a part of Crossroads, I encourage you to give generously. Not because of what God's going to give to you, but because you believe in the work that we're doing together. So as you kind of fill out that Connect card, as you think about your next steps, what's God inviting you into, maybe consider where in your normal everyday life you could give a more compassionate response to someone, right? Maybe it's to get baptized. Maybe read the Gospel of Luke, understanding the tension that is being experienced, that's underlying the evolution of the Jesus movement and the way of thinking about Jesus. It's all still there in the Gospels, but it's just hidden. It's hidden post-resurrection in a lot of ways. But read it and look for, where is there a clash of compassion and holiness? Where is there that clash? Band's going to do this great song. It's called Love is Not Against the Law. It's a really kind of, words are powerful. So as you kind of fill out that Connect card, your offering envelope, get that ready. Just consider your own heart and your life and what this spirit of compassion is inviting you into today. And then I'll be back with our blessing.
Politics or love can make you blind and make you see, make you a slave and make you free, but only one does it all. It's giving up your life for the ones you hate the most. It's giving them your gown when they've taken your clothes. It's learning to admit when you've had a hand in setting them up and knocking them down, because love is not against the law, no. Love is not against the law, no. Love, love, love. Are we defending life when we just pick and choose? Life's acceptable to lose. Which ones to defend? 'Cause you cannot choose your friends, but you can choose your enemies. What if they were one in the same? Could you find a way to love them both the same, to give them your name? Because love is not against the law, no. Love is not against the law, no. Love, love, love. Love is not against the law. Love is not against the law, no. Love, love, love.
Y'all do me a favor, stand with me for our blessing today. If you're a guest, we like to end our time together with a blessing to send us out to be peacemakers in our world. If you want to lift your arms out to just kind of receive this into the spiritual side of who you are. May the ultimate reality, what we call a compassionate God, hold you and comfort you this week. And may you experience a depth of care and warmth in your heart as you surrender to the way of life that Jesus taught and modeled. And may all of our eyes be opened to the ones that our conventional wisdom has labeled as outcasts and sinners. And may you, like Jesus, share a meal and include them fully in your life. May compassion mark our understanding of God and what a life hidden in Christ Jesus looks like. And this week, May each of us, with a heart full of compassion, follow the living Christ to one person that we can bring hope and joy to. Amen. Amen. Have an awesome week, everyone. Don't forget to mark your calendars for Good Friday and Easter. We'll see you next week.